Good morning. We are in Daf Zayin Amud Base 27b, just at the wide lines. And in the mission we saw that there are certain foods that are not allowed to be purchased with the Meiser money, and that's money that somebody transferred their produce that they tithe, that they took as Meiser Sheni as the second tithe, and they transfer it onto money, and the money is brought to Yerushalayim to purchase food. And there's a limit to what food you're allowed to purchase or not. Our Mishnah said you can't purchase water or salt. Brine itself, we saw maybe only if it has fats in it with oil in it. And this, so the Gemara is now going to ask, if everybody agrees you're allowed to purchase fish, but you're not allowed to purchase, but the machlok is whether or not you can purchase fish brine, this tzir. So what's the basis of this machlokas? And this is again on Chav Zayin Amud Base 27b. B'maika mipalgi Rabbi Yehuda ben Gadish Rabbi Eliezer. What machlok with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Eliezer in regards to the brine with fish sauce in it? V'hani tanai, they'll come on, and the opinions that disagree, the chachamim later on. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Gadish Rabbi Eliezer darshi ribui umiyuti v'hani darshi tanai darshi klali prati. The basis is on how to see, how to extrapolate from the pasuk, from the verse in the Torah, when the Torah has a generalization, like over here, where it starts off with, you can purchase all that you desire with your heart, and then it says specifically, it specifies cattle, sheep, wine, old wine. So it starts off with a generalization, on anything you want. Then it gives you a list of a few things, and then it goes back to anything that you would want. Now, how do we look at that? Do we go as a drash of ribui miut v'ribui? That the first statement is inclusive. It adds to it. It's a ribui, and then there's a miut. It diminishes, so it excludes one thing, and then it includes again. Or do we say no, that there's a prati klali prati that is generalization, specification, and generalization? And this is a machlokas that we see throughout Shas. Now, whenever the Torah has verses like this, where it starts off and it says a general statement, then specifies, and then generalizes, do we look at it as klal or prati klal, a generalization, or ribui, or that it's adding? And what distinction is there? We'll see in this Gemara. Rabbi Eliezer darshi ribui miuti. They say that it's adding, and therefore it says it says then you will use this money for everything, for anything you desire. Riba, that's adding to and saying an additional statement. Then when the Torah specified and said in cattle and sheep, in wine and in old wine, meat, then it limited, it diminished what was there beforehand and limited something. Then when it says whatever you would want, whatever your soul would seek, then it included again. So miet v'riba, when it diminished and then it added riba hakol, so it included everything. Because it added and then diminished and then added again, so it's adding everything besides for my Rabbi Kolmili. So it's including everything, any food items. So why did it diminish when it said the specifications of the examples of cattle and sheep and wine? My meat, Rabbi Eliezer miyatzir. So Rabbi Eliezer said, it diminished. It says, but it can't be just a brine with some fish sauce. Rabbi Yehuda ben Gadish miet maimu melach. He says no. If it has fish sauce, that's good enough. It would only be brine alone. But either way, it's some sort of brine that was excluded because that's not going to be enough food-like enough to purchase with your meiser money. But because the Torah added and then specified and then added, so the additions tell you everything's included, and the specification is just there to tell you one thing is excluded, either brine or brine with fish sauce. However, the other opinion, they say it as a generalization, specification, and then generalization, which tells you that it has to be similar to the specification. The Tanya, as we learned, and you'll use this money from the tithe, from the meiser, you're going to use it for anything you desire. Kollel, so that's a kollel, so that's a generalization. And then it says that you will use it for cattle, sheep, and wine, parat. So that's specified. Then it and then it came and re-generalized it by saying, or anything that you desire. So klal prat klal. So this is a general rule for a generalization, specification, generalization. Whatever you're going to learn has to be similar to the specifications. Mahaprat. So we're going to look at the specifications: cattle, sheep, wine, and wine. What are they? Mefurash. The Torah explicitly states produce that can produce of its kind, meaning it has within it the seed to reproduce. Vegedule karka, and grows off the ground. So that's animals that grow off the ground, and produce which grows directly off the ground, and also that they reproduce from themselves. They have the seed within themselves to reproduce. Afkol prima vegedule karka. So that would include everything else that's similar to it. It has to be feeding off the ground and produce from itself. Matani idach, we have another brisa similar. Mahaprat mefurish vlad v'ladas aretz, just as the specifications, the animals and the wine, are something that was created from the earth. Afkol vlad v'ladas aretz. So to anything that was created of the earth. Now, my benai, what's the distinction between these two versions of whether it's prima gedule karka, something that is a fruit of a fruit, meaning something that can reproduce itself and grows off the ground, versus something created from the ground? So the first version is going to say that Abaye said fish is a distinction. And why is fish a distinction? Because that it grows off the ground, and it duging gedule karka. Said first you think, fish also grows off the ground. That it has to be something that was created originally from the ground. Fish were created in the water, not in the ground. So now the Gemara challenges that and says, no, that can't be the distinction between these two interpretations, because actually Abaye is going to tell us that fish is not off the ground. Does Abaye say that fish are off the ground? But Abaye had said, and now we go to Chav Ches Amud Aleph, that we learned. Abaye said, "Achal putisa lekarba." If somebody eats a putisa, it's a type of crustacean from a sea crustacean, some sea creature that's prohibited to eat. If he eats it, he has 4 transgressions. Lekarba, 4 Torah transgressions. 2 of them because it says b'sheretz aretz, right? That you should not eat any creation from the sheretz hamayim, a sea creature, a creepy crawly. It says al tashakses nafshe seichem, don't discuss yourself with these b'chol sheretz hashoretz v'lo tamu, and don't make yourself tameh with them. So that's 2. And then it also says a general term for all sheretz, whether ground or water. It says mibsarim lo techelu, don't eat of their flesh. And it also says anything that has no fins and scales, lo techelu, you shall not eat. So we have 4 transgressions for eating this sea creature. Namola, however, if you eat a ant, meaning a land creature, a bug of some sort, look at Hamish, then there are 5, because for there you have 2 that were both for land and sea creatures, and then there's another 3 where the Torah says anything that crawls on the ground, don't eat. Anything that's a creepy crawly, don't eat, because it's disgusting to you, and don't make yourself tummy with any of these to eat them. So the Torah says 5. There's basically 5 transgressions. 5 times the Torah says not to eat creatures that crawl on the ground. And if somebody eats tzira, a fly, or a flying creature, so for that there's actually 6 prohibitions, because it's an additional one for the sheretz it says also that anything that is a flying creepy crawly is prohibited. So that's an additional one. That's a sixth. Now, from the fact that he makes a distinction between fish and land creatures, so you see that he does not consider the fish to be something that crawls on the land, that comes off the land. Elam Ravina, so rather Ravina says, the distinction would be whether you can buy birds. The one that says that it reproduces itself, and it has gedula karka, it grows off the ground. This would also be off the ground. Birds were actually created from the water marsh, not from the land, and therefore it's going to be excluded. So what's the reason that the one that says birds are included? So he says like this, and the one that excludes birds, what's the reason? So the one who includes the birds is of the opinion, when we see a generalization, specification, generalization, essentially this is a rule for not only over here, but anytime we have this form of structure in the verse in the Torah, and we're trying to learn what the Torah is including, the last generalization is the primary generalization, and therefore it's including more. Parat, dafka, pratu klal, and so therefore I have a specification and a generalization after that. Nasa klal mosav ala prat. So the generalization afterwards is adding to the specification, and since the specification was somewhat limited, but the generalization afterwards is adding to it, it's going to add another level to it. And it's adding another level, even other things that would not be specifically, very close to the specification. And the but the first generalization is there just to tell you that it's not everything that's similar, but it's somewhat similar. So I have a greater ability to include similar to the specification. So I need anything that has these two similarities, that doesn't have these two similarities. But the one who excludes birds, that the first generalization is the main, and therefore uparat, klal, and then say I had a generalization and then a specification afterwards. So that specification is limiting from the generalization. Really, only what is in the specification should be included. Hani in and only these and nothing else. So the second generalization is going to add a little more to that, but it still needs to be very much alike, and so there's going to be three specifications that have to be similar. It's going to have to be similar in three ways, and therefore birds are excluded. I'm going to hear the Shmei Rav. Rav Shmuel Bar Shelas. So Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel Bar Shelas, Mashmei Rav, in the name of Rav. Ma'arvin b'pa'apuin. We can use pa'apuin, which is it's a type of herb, it seems. And it seems it's kakuli in Greek. I don't know what it is. Ubachala glugas, and another type of bean, ubagonias, and in some type of sour cherry. But you may not use unripened grains, so your wheat that's still green. And also not with unripe dates. So the Gemara says, are you allowed to use these gudgonias, which is some type of sour cherry? But we learned that these gudgonias, which is a type of these cherries, they basically cause a temporary sterilization for a male, and therefore somebody that doesn't have children shouldn't eat them. Only somebody that already has many children, so they can eat them. And if this person has a difficulty producing seed, so in any case, shouldn't eat it even if he has children. So we see that it's not that most people can't eat this. So it's not a proper food. So the first version of the Gemara is going to say, Tergama, so it must be that this brisa that says you're allowed to use it for an eruv. This can be your Shabbos meal that you're placing outside of the city to extend your parameter there, where you're allowed to travel. Somebody who doesn't have a problem creating seed and has children. Or perhaps we can say, it could also be somebody that does not have children. But since some people can eat them, somebody who does fit the criteria can eat them. So for him, this counts as a food. And as we've seen in the Mishnah, it doesn't have to be that you yourself can eat it. It just has to be a food that somebody can eat. Mila Tanan, did we not learn in our Mishnah that a Nazir is not allowed to drink wine because of his Nazir oath, is allowed to use wine or grapes as his Eruv food outside of the city, even though that he himself cannot eat them, but somebody can eat them, and we'll see more about that later. Yeah, and similarly, Yisrael b'truma, Yisrael, a non-Kohen is allowed to use teruma food, which he's not allowed to eat. A Kohen has to eat them. Nevertheless, he's allowed to put them out there as his meal. So we see, even though that's not a meal for him himself, but he can make that as his error because it is a meal for someone. So therefore, over here also, even though he can't eat these cherries, it is edible for this other person, for some other person. Or perhaps kikamarav bandakuki. This madoi. There are these cherries that come from madai, from mead, and these are actually good to eat. And that's why that's what he was referring to. The statement from Rav further said that chaziz, which is green grains, they haven't ripened. They're still very moist. But chaziz, you can't use them as an eruv. The Gemara says, but we learned that kishus, which I think is hops, and chaziz, these green grain, you can use as an eruv. So we have a statement of Rav Yehuda in the name of Rav that you're allowed to use the chaziz. So what's this statement of Rav Shmuel Bashelas in the name of Rav that you may not? And furthermore, Rav said that that the bracha for the hops and the green grain are bar pri adama, like any vegetable that grows from the ground. So it depends before Rav came to Bavel or after he came to Bavel. Or Rav, who first studied in Eretz Yisrael, and then he came to Bavel, and in Bavel he saw that some people actually eat green grain. And since people eat green grain in Bavel, so he's changed the halacha that the bracha is bara pri adama, and you can use it as an eruv. So Gemara says, so what? Who cares that if that's what they do in Bavel? Bavel will have a Ruba di Alma. Does that define the typical status for the rest of the world? Is Bavel the majority of the world? That therefore, if in Bavel they eat this, that defines the bracha for everybody. And if in Bavel they eat it, that defines it as a food, even in some way they don't eat it, and you can make an eruv with that. Why would Rav say a general statement for the rest of the world if this is only true in Bavel? But we learned that but we learned that certain beans and barley and tilton, which another green, that if it was planted for vegetables, for the greens, even though that the majority of people plant it for the seed. So if you planted it for the greens, it becomes nullified. Your intent is nullified by the majority. Lafikach zaran chayiv v'yarkan poter, and therefore that you have to tithe the seed, but you don't have to tithe the greens, because the greens are not the reason that most people plant this vegetable for. And so you only have to tithe the main produce, which is the seeds, and not the greens. Hashachalayim agargir shazon liyerik misasin. But shachalayim, which is cress, and gargir, which is another greens, which you eat both the greens and the seed. So there, since you eat both the seed and the greens, you have to take meiser, you have to tithe even the greens, because that is common to eat. And therefore, if you intend for the greens, so you're going to have to tithe both of them. Misasin, zara lazera. But if you planted it only for the seed, then misasin. Sorry. Shalayim agar shazar liyerek misasrin yerek. Yerek v'zera zara l'zera misasin zera v'yerek. Regardless of which way you planted it, whether you planted it for the seed or for the greens, since both of them are edible, you have to tithe both. So Gemara says, Ki kama Rav. So we're going to go back and say, you know what the meaning of Rav is, that you can use these as an Eruv.
Sorry. What? Shazan the Yarek, Misafs the Yarek Vazera, Zern Lazera, Misafs Zera Yarek. Why one is one first and the other that?
Because that was his intent. Whatever was intent, it'll include the other part as well. So if he intended for the seed, so he has to tithe the seed, but the greens as well, because the greens are edible too. If he planted it for the seed, so then the greens are edible as well, so he has to do that too.
But in either event, you have to meiser both. Is that right?
Correct.
Why change the order?
Because that was his intent. He's saying what you intended plus whatever the other is, because your intent is true and the other is also edible.
The ultimate result is the same.
Correct. So Kikama Rav. So when did Rav say his halacha that you can use these green unripened grain as your eruv? Now we turn to Chav Chesam base. The Ganunisa. This is when you planted it in a garden, and it seems like even though that when people had a field of grain, so then they would wait until it dried and they can turn it into flour, etc. But when people had a little garden in the backyard, so a little garden, the grain, there they would eat the grain as it was green as well, and therefore that is edible, and that's its intent, and therefore that is pretty universal, and it would count as food. The Gemara says, what is this? Is there a gargir l'may chazi? What is the seed of this gargir? What is that for? Because when people that didn't have access to peppercorns would grind these up, and it would then be edible. Tessus explains it would be edible. It had to be edible alone, but it would be edible, and typically it would be used for a dip. They would the roast meat, they would dip in it. Rabbi Zera ke have a cholish. Now the Gemara tells us to further this discussion about certain foods, whether or not they typically are planted for them and therefore they count as a food or not. So Rabbi Zera ke have a cholish migirse. He was too weak. Rabbi Zera is too weak to study himself. So he went to the academy of Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ami, and he would sit at the door, Amar, and he said, when the students, the Chachamim, come in and out, I'll be able to get up from them and stand up for them. And this way I'll get the reward that it'll count, that my honor for Torah will give me the opportunity that I also can study Torah. So what happened was that a young child, a young student came out, from the academy. He said, what did your teacher teach you today? He said, that kishus, which let's say is hops, the brach is borei pri adama, and chaziz, this green grain that's not ripe, shakol ni'ebedvar, that the bracha for that is shakol, because it's not a normal way to eat it, and therefore you don't say borei pri adama, the fruit of the ground, because it's not yet fruit of the ground, it's not yet ripened. Amalei, he said to him, Adarabah, quite the contrary. Ipra mistabra. The logic goes the other way around. Haimi ara kamarbi. The grains, they grow from the ground. Even though they're still not ripe, but they're growing from the ground. V'haim avira kamari. But the hops, they're actually up in the air in some shrubs, in some bushes. They're not on the ground. They're not directly from the ground, and therefore they should not be bar priyadam. However, but the student was correct. My timer, hi gamar peri, hi lav gamar peri. Because the hops is a full ripened fruit, so you make the bracha for the food that grows from the ground. It's already a ripe fruit. V'hai lav gamar peri, but the grains that are growing off that are not ripe, that's not a full produce. That's not full produce, and therefore you don't say the bracha. Bar priyadam. But this Rabbi Zera challenged and said, wait, but the hops don't even grow from the ground. They grow up off of these branches as a sort of like a vine that's like a parasitically living off of the tree, but it's not growing from the ground. Not true. Kishus nami mi arakarabi. The hops themselves are also growing from the ground. And how do we know this? The hakachazin and the katlin and the hizmi. Because you see that if you cut down the shrubs that they're in, they would actually they die. So you see that they are living off of the nourishment from the ground. It further said that you cannot use these unripened dates for your eruv. It's not considered a food, and therefore if you put it out as your eruv, it's not going to count. Is that really true? By the time we learned kor nikach bekesem ma'aser. Kor, it seems, is not bamboo shoots.
Hearts of
palm. Hearts of palm. Thank you. Hearts of palm. So hearts of palm. Kor nikach bekesem ma'aser. You can buy that. It constitutes enough of a food that you can purchase it with the ma'aser money. As we saw, it has to be a food. This grows from the ground, and it's a proper food. Now, even though that if you leave it, it will harden and become wood, but right now it's able to be made into food, and so therefore it counts as food. However, it's not enough of a food that'll turn into that it's susceptible to tuma as a food. And these unripe figs, unripe dates. They are so much a food that not only are you allowed to buy it with meiser money, but you could also, it also is susceptible to tumah as food. So we see it's even more food than hearts of palm. And you're telling me that I can't use it as an eruv, but we see over there it's a food proper. So Rabbi Yehuda, however, Rabbi Yehuda in this brisa, he disagrees, and he says no, that this hearts of palm are actually like wood, and therefore it does not count as food. But you could purchase with meiser money. You could purchase the hearts of palm with meiser money because it is a pre-mipri. It is something that has seeds that can regenerate, and it grows from the ground, and that's so it fits the bill. As the Torah's description of the klal prat klal, as we saw in the generalization, specification, generalization, but you cannot actually you can't it won't be susceptible to tuma, and then perhaps it wouldn't be fine enough as an eruv. Now, so the Gemara says, even Rabbi Yehuda is going to say that these figs, these dates, that unripened dates, are fruit for all manners. So we have a problem. How can Rav say that? Rabbi Yehuda say in the name of Rav that the produce, these unripened dates are not allowed to be used for an eruv when we see that it's proper fruit. Ella sheptunas min ha'meiser. Rabbi Yehuda says the only thing is, even though that it has a halacha of fruit, it's just exempt of tithing itself. So the Gemara says there's a distinction. The first attempt the Gemara is going to say that there's a distinction between whether they are ever going to ripen or not. And there are two types of palm trees. There are the male trees and the female trees. And the female trees, the fruit ripen fully, and the male trees, the dates are these unripened, and they never really ripen. So this is as ripe as it's going to get. So hasam ben ischani. These fruits that are never really going to ripen anymore, and therefore this is as ripe as it's going to get. So this is the complete fruit, and they're made to be taken like this. Whereas if it was these unripened fruit in the level of in a tree that could ripen, so there Rabbi Yehuda says you can't use it for an eruv because it never is going to get ripened. Rabbi Yehuda and the Brisa, which talk about that it is a fruit and it has all halachas of fruit, that's talking about these dates that will never ripen, and this is as ripe as it's going to get. So Gemara says, so then why is Rabbi Yehuda say that it's exempt of the tithe of Meiser? This is the full fruit. This is as ripe as it's going to get. And as we learned, Fatani, we learned, Rabbi Yehuda, these figs that are not fully ripened from this place called Besioni are only mentioned in regards to tithing Movad alone, only in regards to Meiser. That these figs and this place Tuvina, the Ahini, which is figs, these unripened figs of this place Tuvini, Chayav Meiser, unripened dates and the figs are going to be obligated in Meiser, and they come from these places Besioni and Tuvina. Now, so since we see that they are obligated in Meiser, we see that they are a full fruit, and for sure it's fruit for in regards to other things as well. So Gemara says, so you must be, you're right. We're not talking about these fruits that are never going to ripen. It's even in fruits that will ripen. Well, the Indian tumas eichlam shiny. However, there's a distinction between it becoming susceptible to tuma as a food versus whether it counts as a food in regards to making it an eruv. And there's a distinction. Like Rabbi Yochanan said, it'll be susceptible to tuma as a food in as much as I could change it and ripen it by heating it up, and that will sweeten it enough that I'm able to eat it. And that's going to count as susceptible to tuma as a food, but it's not enough that I can make an eruv. Just as Rabbi Yochanan said that there, it'll apply over here as well in regards to these dates and figs that are not ripe, that since I could ripen them by heating them, that's going to be sufficient. So where did Rabbi Yochanan say this halacha that since you can ripen them, it does count as enough of a ripe fruit? Where did Rabbi Yochanan say that? He said it about this manner. The Tani we learn, shkedem amorim, bitter almonds, katanim chayavim. If they're small, so they are obligated. They are obligated in maaser. You have to tie them, and the reason is because that is the complete fruit. Because when they're the larger they get, the more bitter they get. So this small size is actually a good size for it, and so that's sort of like the complete fruit. Gedolim peturim, but once they become too big, it's going to be exempt of maaser because it's so bitter. It's not really food anymore. Mesukein, however, the sweet almonds, gedolim chayavim katanim peturim, when they're large and full, they will be. They are. That's its complete fruit, and so that's when you're obligated in tithing in the maaser. Whereas when they're small, you're exempt because it's not a full fruit yet. It has more to grow and become sweeter and better. Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yossi, and Mishamoviv, but Shimon, the son of Rabbi Yossi, said in the name of his father, Rabbi Yossi, that zevazelaptur. Both of them are going to be exempt when they're not a complete. If they're bitter, regardless of whether they're small or big, whether they're going to grow more bitter or less. Right now, they're not sweet, so they're going to be exempt. Because they're not considered fruit. And some say no. But that Rabbi Yossi said the other way around, that either way, while they're bitter, they're going to be obligated in maaser. And Amar Eloi, That Rabbi Chanina taught in Tzipori that the halacha is that it would actually be like Rabbi Yossi's opinion in the version that said that both would be exempt because they're too bitter and they're not really fruit. But how do we explain the opinion that says that both of them, both regardless of whether they're going to grow more bitter when they get bigger or they're going to grow sweet when they grow bigger, and right now they're bitter and they're small and they're going to be obligated in Meiser? Why? What can you do with it? It's a bitter almond. Rabbi Yochanan said, even though right now it's exempt, right now it's not really edible, it's obligated on account of that you could make it sweet by roasting them. Or if you roast them, they'll become sweeter, and therefore you're obligated in Meiser. So we see that this concept that it can be considered a food and it'll be Meiser in regards to in regards to its susceptibility to Tumah, and in Meiser, because you can sweeten it by roasting it. But yet, Rav said in regards to Eruv, it is not a valid Eruv because right now it's not edible. Amar Mar. So we have just learned that Rabbi Yehuda Omer Kor Hareyu Ka'etz L'Chol Davar. That Kor, this hearts of palm, is going to be considered wood in regards to all matter. However, you're allowed to use meiser money to buy it because it is something that comes from the ground. It's something that regenerates. It has its seed with it, and so therefore it fits what the Kollel Kollel taught us. The pasuk teaches anything you want. Bakar would say cattle, sheep, wine, and anything that you want. And so that specification generalization tells you that everything is included, and even hearts of palm. So the Gemara says, Haina Tanakama. So that's exactly like the first opinion.
I would assume in today's agriculture that there's certain kinds of palms that they raise specifically for hearts of palm. Is that's a correct assumption?
I assume the same, but
picture here for the discussion. Would that change the picture for this discussion? I mean, if they were specifically raised, these trees are raised for hearts of palm harvesting.
I don't know if it'll change for Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says since they will harden if you leave them, they are currently wood. Rabbi Yehuda's not saying it's not edible. He's saying, yeah, but since if you leave them, they'll harden. That's wood. It turns into wood if you leave it too long, so that means it's wood.
Got it.
So I don't know if it would change for that. Some halachas do depend on that. Like we saw at the beginning, that these green grains, it depends where it is. If it's grown for green grains, so then people eat it that way. That's what it's meant for. That's that agricultural norm is going to define it. Whereas, and same as in Bavel. In Bavel they eat it, so that's going to define it. So too nowadays, certain things that if that's the way they're grown, that will define what it is. Whereas I think like canned pineapple. Most canned pineapple is harvested when they're completely raw and inedible. I mean, they're totally young and not really edible. And they're made to ripen in the vessels. And yet we say ha'adama, even though that if you ate that fruit itself, when it's picked off as a pineapple, it's so inedible that it would be shakol. You would not say the bracha. So you're right in concept that sometimes this is the norm of the norm practice of the agricultural world will define the proper produce. So that is going to be true. But I think over here, Rabbi Yehuda is saying it by definition, since if it will harden if you leave it, so therefore it's ba'alma, it's just a piece of wood, an edible piece of wood, but wood. It seems like the same opinion. He says that it's you can purchase it with the money from the tithe, from the meiser. No, the distinction is if you cooked it a lot in order to make it soft, or you fried it, where according to Rabbi Yehuda, even though that you cooked it and fried it, now it's more edible, so what? He says it's not about whether it's edible or not. It's a piece of wood. So it doesn't have susceptibility to tumah on account of that it's not edible. Not that it's not edible, on account that it's not food. It's a piece of wood. Whereas The Tanakama says once you've cooked it a lot or softened it or you fried it, at that point it's gonna be susceptible to tuma as a food. Maskif le'Rav. So Rav challenged that. Is there really anybody that holds after you cooked it and you fried it and you made it into food, it's not susceptible to tuma? But Tani, we learned even something more extreme than that. Ha'or v'hashilya, hides of an animal, or a miscarried the amniotic sac, etc. They're not susceptible to tuma of food because it's not food. That's disgusting. It's not edible. However, if you soaked and cooked the hides enough that it's now soft and you intend to eat it, or the shilya that you intend to eat, the sac and fetus that you intend to eat, that is susceptible to tumah on account of that you're considering it food, so it's food. So therefore, for sure, hearts of palm would be that way. So Rabbi Yehuda can't disagree with that. So Rabbi Yehuda doesn't mean that. Rather, what he means is rather the distinction between the Chachamim and Rabbi Yehuda, everybody agrees it's not really susceptible to tumah at this state, and but you could purchase it with meiser money. The question is, what bracha do you make on it? The as we learned, kor is hearts of palm. Rabbi Yehuda says that you're going to make a bar pri adama because it's a fruit from the ground. And Shmuel Amar shakol niyemedvar. And Shmuel says no, the bracha is shakol because it's wood. It's not a normal food. It's not the main fruit of this tree. It's not really an edible fruit. So Rabbi Yehuda Amar bar pri adama uchlu. It's a regular food. However, Shmuel Amar shakol niyemedvar kivash sefer lahakshis lemavirchen bar pri adama. Since it's wood. If you leave it, it would harden. So yes, you harvest it young, and therefore you can turn it into food. But still, the bracha is going to be shakol nehiyeh b'dvar. Amar Shmuel Rav Yehuda. So Shmuel said to Rav Yehuda, "Shinana kavasech mistabra," a sharp one. He called his student Rav Yehuda the sharp one because of his brilliance. And it says, "Sharp one, kavasech mistabra." You seem what you taught seems to be correct. That's non shesefel hachshis, because radish also, if you leave it, it's going to harden. And yet, we say a bracha bar pri adama on it at the state that it is still good, that is edible. However, the Gemara says v'lohi, but that's not really true. Even though Shmuel is told Rabbi Yehuda, I think I'm wrong. I think you're right. Nevertheless, the halacha is like Shmuel because Shmuel is right. Because radishes. People actually plant to take it when it's young so that they can eat it. But palm trees, people don't plant for the hearts of palm. Now, of course, here Michael's point would be relevant that nowadays that they do plant it for that, so then the bracha would be borei pri adama. The Avagam, the Kal say Shmuel Rav Yehuda, and even though the Shmuel told Rav Yehuda, I think your opinion is correct, nevertheless, halacha should say to Shmuel that if it's not planted for the hearts of palm, the bracha would be shakol nehiyeh b'dvar. Okay.